Welcome to J-Live with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. One of the things that I have started noticing with ubiquity, not just comments on my YouTube podcast, but also just every time I fall into one of these, doom spiral, scrolls on Instagram or Facebook or any of the like, is right-wing influencers who have become ripe with anti-Zionism. One of the things that's been commented, I think, on every single one of my last couple of podcasts is the quote, imagine getting kicked out of 109 countries and still thinking you are the problem, which, I have soon observed has become a, right-wing anti-Semitic slash anti-Zionist talking point. But, in a more serious capacity, this is not something, if you asked me 5 years ago, I wouldn't have really thought about anti-Zionism and the right being bedfellows. It was always the progressives and the left, the far left, the Islamists who were the anti-Zionists. Sure, you had anti-Semites on the right, obviously some cohort of neo-Nazis, obviously, supersessionist Christians who, have all sorts of ideas about Jews, but generally a lot of that came with actually supporting Zionism. There's a lot to say about that, but today I wanted to talk about the rise of anti-Zionism on the political right, and I could not have thought of somebody better to have this conversation with than Kimo Gandall. Kimo recently graduated Harvard Law School. He is now the CEO of Fortuna Invites. I hope I got that name. Insights. There we go. It is an AI court system. So maybe on a different podcast, if I ever talk about AI, we'll bring you on to talk about that. But it sounds very impressive. And Kimo also has deep ties to the Republican Party. When he was in college at UC Irvine, he was the chairman of the California College Republican State Board and has mentored many people who are up and coming in the Republican Party, and really just seems to know everybody that's involved in Republican politics. So Kimo, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Very happy to be here.
So I don't know why, but my algorithm has started feeding me Charlie Kirk videos. And one of the interesting things about Charlie Kirk, let's just start here, is he's been a pretty stalwart defender of Israel. And what's been interesting, and for listeners that don't know Charlie Kirk, he's a right wing, pundit, and he really sets up shop in the middle of campus with this big sign saying, sort of ask me anything, and people really line up. And a lot of times, l'chaim, for those just listening, Kimo is, one shot in already. Are you playing a drinking game? Is this, every time I mention something, you'll take a shot?
Yeah, exactly. I'm taking a shot and I'm drinking coffee. This has to be exciting. It has to be big.
Okay, there we go. I love the mixture. Maybe we'll do one of these 4-hour podcasts then, if you're, equally caffeinated and drunk at the same time by the end of it. No, but I've been seeing a lot of Charlie Kirk videos, which, one of the interesting things that I've noticed is recently, at least the ones that make it into my algorithm, are some young, generally right-wing man or student challenging Charlie Kirk from an anti-Zionist perspective of saying, why is America giving Israel aid? To even more nefariously, right? That's maybe a reasonable political position, but all the way to, haven't you read the Talmud with his Jewish, conspiracy plot to control the world? It is clear that this is happening through Israel. So I wanted to just, get general senses. I mean, I have a lot of examples written down, but when I called you a couple of weeks ago about this topic, because I had been seeing it, with just increasing alarm, you sort of said, yeah, it exists, but I don't really see it there. Now we're talking, it's June 24th, and this is right after a couple of days after, Trump hit Iran, but that was another major fissure point in the Republican Party, right? You had people like Tucker Carlson or, Candace Owens and the like really pushing back. I'll add the comedian Dave Smith, Theo Vaughn. I don't know if Joe Rogan's officially considered a Republican now, but, Joe Rogan types, right, really hitting hard against not just AIPAC, but really any connection to Israel or anything like that. So anyway, microphone is yours, Kimo.
Yeah, so thank you for having me on. So let's break down a few descriptive features here first. So there are several factions in the Republican Party, and what I'm going to talk about today is going to break down between the activist groups and the institutionalist groups. What I mean by, I don't like saying the word establishment. It's too negative. It's also not accurate. Institutionalist groups come and go. Establishment really has some sort of connotation as to what their ideology is. Institutions just describe who's in power, who decides. Activist groups I will generally describe here as those who don't have the power to decide. They are simply activists. They can change the dialogue. So let's break down a few of those groups. In the college sector specifically, you see, I would probably say the furthest to the right, I'm saying the reject Christianity, reject Judeo-Christian values, reject kind of all these normative apparatuses. They would be the neo-Nazis, they would be the alt-right, right? You really saw their prevalence back at the first Trump administration. That's more that faction is not really around anymore for a couple of reasons. For one, it lacked ideological salience. It was not palatable to the norms of the United States, and it really wasn't run by people who knew what they were doing. So the Richard Spencer types just didn't get very far.
And they really, also, and these are, I mean, what you're describing is sort of the, I call them the tiki torch people, right? The Jews will not replace us rally. But what was interesting about them is they were explicitly anti-Semitic almost by, by stated creed, meaning they wouldn't have been upset if you called them, hey, you are anti-Semitic. They would say, yes, we are. Thank you so much for noticing. What I've been noticing, where I think you're about to get to, is someone like the comedian Dave Smith, who identifies as a libertarian, or someone like Tucker Carlson. If you called Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens anti-Semitic, they would essentially say some version of what you'd hear on the left and say, just because I'm against giving military aid to a state in the Middle East, what, I'm anti-Semitic, when of course they are, so anyway, I cut you off, but
sure. No, that's absolutely a good point, and I am going to get there. There's one faction we're missing, though, which are the Groypers. Now, the Groypers are analytically different than the alt-right through Richard Spencer. When you think of the Groypers, you think more of the Nick Fuentes crowd. Their positions tend to be more palatable, right? They're not out there saying we are Nazis. They're not out there, advocating the mass genocide of specific groups, although they tend to borderline that at times. But they tend to align themselves with normative doctrines. What do I mean by that? They tend to align themselves with the Catholic Church's catechism. They tend to view themselves as religious conservatives. And they tend to root their ideology in tradition and history, as opposed to kind of this Nietzschean sense the alt-right had with Richard Spencer, Bronze Age pervert, those types of intellects. And what makes them analytically different from who you were talking about, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, etc., is they would go one step further. In fact, actually, a few years ago, I'd probably disagree with you on this, but actually, I think this is probably more specific, in which they do think that Jewish influence is a problem in the United States. They would make that claim. They would claim they're not anti-Semitic because they would just say it's incidental to that group. They wouldn't say it's like inherent to being Jewish, as opposed to the alt-right, who think there's like a genetic problem with Jews. But both of those groups tend to not be in the mainstream prevalence. Although I will say, it sounds like your memes more verge on the Groyper, right?
Yeah. Again, I'm just, because I've noticed, because I somehow, I mean, you're the AI guys, but, you can tell me it's probably all bots, but I've noticed the second I upload YouTube videos, it's very good for the algorithm, by the way, so I don't want them to stop. But, I get an immediate slew of just comments that, they're always, one or two types. Usually there'll be some New Testament quote, some quote from the Talmud. It's one of the things, we're not even talking about anti-Zionism yet, but, anti-Semitism is interesting to be able to tell, like, right-wing from left-wing anti-Semitism. If it's quoting a religious passage, whether it be the Bible or the Talmud, it's almost always right-wing anti-Semitism. I mean, I'm sure that there's a couple of, exceptions, but that's very much the sort of Nick Fuentes, Groyper crowd. I'm not really, and it's always unclear, what percent is this just edgy memes and what percent is this serious, right? All that is granted. But what we're seeing now is really within the mainstream. I mean, arguably, eventually I'm going to push you, because I think even somebody like J.D. Vance, I obviously don't think he should be in the same conversation necessarily as Candace Owens, but I was even talking about this a year ago before the election. One of, whenever people said the Trump administration would obviously be better for Israel than the Harris administration, my one caveat to that was, well, there is this isolationist wing that's growing, and this isolationist wing, they're not anti-Israel the same way, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar are anti-Israel, but if their view is complete apathy towards Israel, which, I view as the greatest ally to, one of America's greatest allies, and it's no secret that the U.S. gives Israel tons of aid money every year that I think benefits both Israel and America, right? I can actually see J.D. Vance, and I'm curious if you agree with this claim, cutting American aid to Israel before I can see Kamala Harris doing that.
I'm going to have to disagree with that. J.D. Vance is prudential. So just like, and this is where I'm actually getting now to what the mainstream right is, kind of Trumpism, right? Which is very different from I know our progressive friends might say they're the same as the alt-right. It's just not true. J.D. Vance comes in with more of a traditionalist wing on the Trump branch. He's not isolationist per se, but he is prudential, right? So like, if you see, I think it was really illuminating to see a lot of the leaked texts, right? What is J.D. Vance's problems? Well, J.D. Vance has consistently texted within his inner circles, spoken on Twitter, basically about two principles, which is one, virtue, which we could talk about later with the classical legal tradition that's having a serious comeback with all the battles that are going on in the judiciary. And second, what just happens to kind of be the most efficient foreign Machiavellian policy, right? He's very much a classical realist, not a neo-realist. He's not a pro-international institutions like the Waltzians are, like Bush was. So he's on a different strand. His view is just Israel is important only insofar as it furthers American interests. If aid happens to do that, then so be so. But part of the growing critique on the American right is that Israel is engaged in a prolonged conflict that it should have already solved. That is kind of Trump's recent argument about Iran, right? So today, actually, Trump pretty harshly criticized Israeli leadership for continuing the bombings in Iran. And that basically reflects kind of this idea that America is with Israel, but it's only with Israel insofar that it's prudential to further our foreign interests. Now, there's a question about why do we care that Iran is bombing Israel? Obviously, the answer to that is it harms our foreign interests in multitude of ways, right? It destabilizes oil trade. That's the economic view. Also, Israel is an ally. We don't want our allies being attacked because then it undermines us in other spheres. Trump acts through strength, right? So if the little guy's being hit, Trump wants to show he's going to intervene to prevent other factions from being attacked. And he does that, he really is just inheriting the mantle of the Reaganites, which said peace through strength, right? And so that's probably why Trump attacked Iran. Now, if we actually go back further, there's been a lot of critiques on the American right. And I actually think you probably remember this when we went to Israel on the Fact Finders trip. My critique was when we went near to Gaza, I said, Israel should occupy Gaza and install an administrator. This is an unsustainable situation. I took the people
to the best of my knowledge, just to give readers or listeners some color. This is 2018, I think. This is my first year working on campus. Kimo was, I think, a sophomore or junior at UC Irvine. You were the president of College Republicans. We spent 2 weeks gallivanting around the Holy Land together. So yes,
it was amazing.
Some editorial background.
Yeah, and I mean, studying international relations at the time, it actually changed my perspective a lot. And you actually had a podcast on this, which is, I think a lot of our liberal friends editorialize international politics far too much. What I mean by that is they try to prescribe motivations to explain seemingly irrational interests. For example, Hamas, with their crazy manifesto on the Jews taking over the world and they want to genocide everyone. They're like, oh, no, that's just a function of the oppressor-oppressed dialectic. And it's not actually what they want to do. And really, this comes back to this Marxist strain of thinking that inherits the left, which is trying to bring out material underlying assumptions about the way people think about things, right? Not everybody.
I've been saying this for years that you should go into politics, after you're done building this incredible company, because you did the thing that I think, pundits on the right are so good at, which the whole premise of this podcast was to criticize elements of the right for anti-Zionism. And without me even realizing, you've subtly shifted to now talking about the Marxist anti-Zionist. So that was incredible.
I do actually like staying on topic. Thank you for correcting me, because this frustrates me whenever I was at UCI. People would always subtly shift the conversation. But yeah, to get back to the right's critique was we take religious people at their word, which I think psychologically is in part because the right understands religion. They understand having a motivation rooted in a higher good as opposed to just material wealth, which is what the Marxists think. And so because we understand that, we also equally ascribe as taking Hamas at their word, right? And when we went around and we asked Palestinians, I would always ask the question about the Temple Mount, right? And you had this great podcast on it where basically there was no reconciliation that was possible there. One side thinks they are entitled by God to it. The other side, to some extent, also equally thinks that. And so because there's no equal reconciliation there, there's no way you're going to have this material inducement of peace. And what I mean by that is, we'll have some trade treaties and some aid, and then everything will be kumbaya. The right did not think that. And so I think the frustration on the right was that Israel at the time was not willing to do what it needed to bring peace to the region. Now, obviously, that has changed now. The geopolitical reality is that Gaza will not exist as it did before. Hamas will not exist. They're Probably, in the best case for the Palestinians, will be an Israeli administrator. Elsewise, it will be annexed into Israel. That's a separate conversation. But the reason you really haven't seen a lot of this human rights discourse from the right, with the exception of, Candace Owens, but even with them, they talk about it in the framework of American first nationalism, not in this abstract neoliberal United Nations Geneva Convention speak, is because the priorities of the right have nothing to do with that. And our frustration is we see American resources have gone to waste. That, if I'm trying to charitably represent the Carl Tuckerson view, that is essentially what it means.
Do you think it would be fair to suggest, so the right generally, and I say this as somebody who has done many podcasts on left-wing anti-Semitism and Soviet anti-Semitism, so I think my credentials are good there for criticizing left-wing anti-Semitism. But typically, at least if we're taking, a very, very broad span of the last 200 years, the right or nationalists, right? Let's just use that instead of right or left. Nationalists have produced a lot more anti-Semitism than liberals or progressives and even leftists, right? If we're talking about the 20th century in Western Europe, it's sort of, hard to argue against that. I'm sure people, might.
Well, we can talk about the Soviets, but okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, totally granted. Yeah. And I've done, many podcasts about left-wing anti-Semitism. You should definitely go check those out. Right. So that is 100% granted. It's most of what I talk about these days is left-wing anti-Semitism. But the right sort of has always had this sort of nationalist type of anti-Semitism mixed with a lot of, I think, latent Christian anti-Semitism. Maybe we can get into that a little bit. I just for listeners' background, you are a devout Catholic, just so they're understanding where you might be coming from. And then when that gets mixed with geopolitics, what I sort of see with Candace Owens is you almost have this early 1900s anti-Semitic, conspiracy theories of the Jews as the globalists that are trying to take over the world, but then applied to Israel, right? In a weird way, because Candace Owens, somebody like Candace Owens is not just upset that her tax money is going to waste with the Iron Dome, right? Like, that's at least somewhat understandable when I see all these memes saying, hey, there are children, starving in Tennessee, and meanwhile, we're giving Israel money for the Iron Dome. I disagree with that because I think that there is a long game here, but I at least understand that argument. I think it's a reasonable argument. I emotionally empathize with that argument as to why somebody might feel like that. But when Candace Owens talks about how there's this, Jewish media conspiracy to shut her out of the Daily Wire, when in reality she's spreading virulent anti-Semitism after October 7th, right? Like, that's something more than just, shoot, they're wasting resources, right? So I'm curious, where you
sure, and yeah. So for one, I'm going to try to charitably interpret each one of these people's arguments. Candace Owens in particular, I think the cynical argument would be she got fired from Daily Wire and she needs to make a brand for herself, right? And you know this better than anyone. Anti-normative, i.e. edgy content produces clicks, clicks produce revenue, revenue is how you live. And so this was actually my theory back when I talked to you about kind of the Groyper crowd, which is one way to create a movement is to be anti-normative. And that's in part because the method in which the dialogue is exchanged in society has changed, right? Even back in the 1960s, right? You were able to have these overwhelmingly peaceful movements because there wasn't this white noise that was a barrier to entry, right? Part of the reason from like a pure political science angle, I'm able to understand the motivations of Black Lives Matter is because they were trying to break through that noise barrier. And actually, they did it quite successfully. Now, it had a terrible reaction against them and it backfired, which is the danger with these movements, right? But I think from a cynical angle, you could describe it as anti-normative. But for a second, let's take it as charitable, meaning like she actually believes what she is saying, and this is not kind of a way for her to further her media career. Because I think there's also instances like Kanye West, for example, where you can talk about it. I'm not sure Kanye West has the intellectual rooting to anti-Semitism that maybe Candace Owens has, right?
But he also never really platformed it, right? Meaning, like, I care. Like, let's take the Kanye West of the left, which is Macklemore, right? I don't know, right. I don't know enough about Macklemore, right? But like, I don't really care what Macklemore has to say the same way I don't really care. I mean, it's obviously hurtful if somebody like Kanye West, who has, bajillions of more, followers than anyone else I know. But that, I'm not trying to intellectually diagnose somebody like Kanye West. Candace Owens, I mean, not that I was ever a fan of her, but she was relatively mainstream in right-wing circles even 5 years ago. I mean, the Daily Wire is probably one of the most successful. She was a normal on top,
To slightly interrupt you, there's a reason. The reason I pointed that out is because both of their strains of anti-Semitism have emerged at the same time, and there's a reason that's happened. I think it's incentivized by the market conditions, which incentivize clicks, right? They incentivize you to be edgy because otherwise you can't break through the noise boundary. To be fair, I also think there's a good explanation and argument that neither of them were driven purely by market forces, and those market forces were incidental to them breaking through the noise barrier and being popular. Like Kanye West, he clearly has some mental issues, and he's talked about that. The song he released before doesn't have a song. It's like a Heil Hitler song, right? It was Cousins, and it was about sexual assault and getting high, like a lot of underlying mental illness problems. But also, you are correct in saying that there is a intellectual history with right-wing anti-Semitism. And it's not just anti-Zionism, it's anti-Semitism. And part of the reason I would say that is it's a little difficult. This is even from the Groyper angle, right? It is difficult on the right to say, I don't think Jews should have a state, but I think white people should have a state. At that point, the distinction makes it clear you're just anti-Semitic.
Well, generally, meaning if I'm going to even like twist the knife in a little bit more in this, it's funny because, you go full circle enough and then you become an anti-Zionist on the other side where, a big right-wing argument was we want the Jews out of here. Let's get them their own state so they don't bother us here in, Germany.
I believe the Nazis in the original plan was Madagascar, right? They had all these different plans.
Sure. And so, but I'm not really, meaning I'm not surprised. Maybe you are, but I'm not surprised at anti-Semitism on the right. What's been surprising is that mainstream right-wing, or maybe not surprising, but that mainstream right-wing figures are becoming anti-Zionist, right? That's, I'm sure you saw the, now viral conversation between Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson.
Yes,
and I watched clips of that, and, I don't know what you thought as somebody, who's obviously shares a faith with them when they start talking about Christianity. It's very interesting as an outside observer, but just, and if listeners aren't familiar, Ted Cruz was basically saying that he supports Israel as a Christian because it's the Bible and everything like that. And Tucker Carlson was apparently calling him out. And I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, even questioning whether or not the Jews are the ancient Jews in the Bible, and everything there.
Yeah, that was really
which not that I necessarily think the best reason to support Israel is because it says so in the Bible, but then to sort of have the pushback of Tucker Carlson, is probably one of the most listened to media figures right now on the right, essentially use what I consider to be almost a left-wing talking point, right? They're not the real Jews. The real Jews are actually European, which is shocking because the whole idea that Ashkenazi Jews are just European was attempted to be a bulwark against right-wing anti-Semitism that was specifically saying Jews are not European. So that's the weird switch that I'm seeing with people like Tucker Carlson, where, 10 years ago when you turned on Fox News and listened to Tucker Carlson, he was pro-Israel, right? And I don't think the reason why a Tucker Carlson or a Candace Owens has turned on Israel, it's not because they've studied the data and are upset at the human damage in Gaza and everything like that, because a lot of the, when I look at it, a lot of, the comments.
Yeah, the right is not worried about that. That is
not that I think, Instagram and YouTube comments are the best way to, gauge political knowledge. But, I don't know, the polls have been wrong in all the elections beforehand. So maybe we need some new metric. I've even seen people talk about, the 0-state solution. And it's some meme about, both the Jews and the Arabs, all getting blown up. And that's, that's probably more in the Groyper camp of like, oh, haha, we don't care about any of these people. But something shifted within elements of the right, and what I fear, and if you disagree, push back, it's growing, and it seems like it's growing very quickly with, it's almost like the people that are still defending, general pro-Israel and aid to Israel and AIPAC and all this, very mainstream Republican stuff, they're almost like the old, out of touch, maybe the institutionalists, and there's this new age of, young people coming up and they see through the BS. And, I think, the silent part out loud is that this is all just, some plot by, the global Jews and the media to, have bought out all these politicians.
I get what you're saying. Let me push back for a second. Again, this is why I like using the word institutionalist and not establishment. Establishment is more of that moderate ideological angle. What I mean by institutionalist is that they have the power to decide. And on the right, the idea is that law as a teacher, and that people mimic that in their day-to-day actions. And I think that's still accurate. If you look at every major college Republican organization, which is where the activism would happen, right? That would be downstream of the Republican Party itself. Not a single one is out there condemning Israel. Not a single one. Not the CRNC, not the CRA, not NFCR. And those are the only really three major national groups left. There was kind of a split. We can go over that later. That had nothing really had to do with CRNC corruption back in my day. Not a single one. And there's a good reason for that. And no, it's not because the Jews control the donors and everything like that. No, it has nothing to do with that. These organizations are not funded by big dollars, right? They're usually they have budgets under $1 million. So these are not major operations, but they have a ton of members that are influential. And there's a reason for that. And it's because the institutionalists understand everything from the J.D. Vance angle. I do think the institutionalists are beginning to adopt ideological angles. I mean, given I am an institutionalist, effectively, right? Or my successors are, more of the J.D. Vance angle, which is that it's just a matter of prudence. And there is frustration. And to be fair, when I would see our president, there's tons of articles on this. I expressed some of my frustration about Israel resolving this issue quickly. If you also look at it, I thought it was very interesting. You had a podcast before on kind of the human rights violations going on in Israel. None of the institutional actors are talking about that on the right. Not a single one. Yes, I'm pretty sure. There might be one or two congressmen who talk about it, right? But it's usually incidental. So like the Tucker Carlson take, right? It's incidental to his interests in America. And maybe you talk about it in the biblical sense, right? So another dialectic change is that evangelicals tended to dominate the American theological lens, at least in terms of Christianity. And that has changed to Catholicism. Really, I think that changed first in terms of the members of the institution, and then slowly it's built itself into the dialogue. If you look, for example, in the judiciary, right, it's basically all Catholics.
Yeah, talk me through this. I'm gonna go on a little bit of a tangent here. I actually just got back I was officiating a wedding in Ohio, and so I've had the book I've had J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, on my shelf for years, and I hadn't read it. And I said, I'm going to Ohio. I'm taking this book. And it was a really interesting book. I read the whole thing, on the flights and over the weekend. And he talks a lot about, how Catholicism really transformed his life. And, he's not alone, because I've even witnessed on campus. Obviously, I mostly interact with Jewish students, but I get to interact with, people like you through, just wider campus. And I've witnessed this sort of Catholic rebirth, whatever we want to call it. What explains this? I mean, why is
so? Yeah. So rightfully so. Very quick history on the church. We had something called Vatican II happen kind of during the Boomer era, right? It was really a vibe, even though the church formally promulgated a new and changed doctrine and purpose of the church, which aimed the church towards evangelization. There was an idea that the church had become too insular, too conservative, too right-wing, even some might call it. And so there was this change brought about. It kind of was embodied by Pope Francis. We are now seeing kind of this new age of Catholicism, which is incredibly skeptical of the Vatican II changes for good reasons, but at the same time embodies those, right? Because Vatican II is all about evangelization. And this new Catholicism you're seeing is about transformation of people who weren't Catholic before or were not practicing Catholic. That's their J.D. Vance crowd, right? And so they're really this new Pope Leo shift intellectually. And part of the reason is, and J.D. Vance talks about this, is mainstream evangelical Christianity is basically just intellectually indefensible. It has no deep theological roots. Its doctrines aren't well developed. And so
can you just explain that for I'll be a little bit flippant, just because, I've known you for years and know you would appreciate this.
Sure.
So for people that don't know that I've known you for 8 years, this is going to sound mean, but for a group of Jews who think all Christian doctrines are equally,
sure.
indefensible, why specifically is evangelicism less defensible than Catholicism?
Yeah, so it has no... there's okay, we get into a lot of reasons, and I don't want to broadly overstroke evangelicals because there's not a single branch of them. They all have different ideas, which is part of the problem, right? When it comes down to the roots of the church, right? Catholicism has deeply defined ideas about God, rooted back to Aquinas and his cosmological arguments that understand the Bible. What Catholicism's central virtue is participating in reason to understand God. Again, that's a little different. We want to get down the scholastic train from Maimonides, right? Who would say you use reason to discover God's benefits. That is different from just partaking in reason and then being guided by that through natural law. And part of that shift is then how people understand your day-to-day lives. Fundamentalism has, if I'm going to not be charitable to evangelicals, my good co-founder and friend, lifelong friend of mine, Kenny McLaren, we went to the Creationist Museum in Kentucky, right? And when you go into some place like this, now to be fair, the Creationists, they're good people. Some of them I assume are good people. Some of their doctrines are a little funny, right? Like saying the last dragon was shot down by the Arizona Rangers, right? And people begin to view this over time, and it's more and more difficult to discern reality when you have this viewpoint. Now, to some extent, we can get into this later. I think actually Revelation is a very interesting point, and I think we're generally seeing a spark of spiritualism come back into America. One, I think, is necessitated by the advent of AI, in part because people are going to have to figure out what to do and figure out what purpose is. And every time we have this throughout history, even back to the 1800s, we had Nietzsche, right? And later we had skepticism emerge, is that people have to discover new ways to define their lives. And really, spirituality is the way you go about doing that. Catholicism allows people to have a reasoned, oriented, and traditionally rooted way to discover that. And it is the only way that we view as consistent. Now, we get into certain doctrines. I'll give you a perfect example: free will. Calvinists do not believe in free will. And, there's some arguments about where this comes from. If you're a more mainstream Protestant, for example, if you're a Lutheran, right, you'd probably harken back to Kantianism, which views the law as an abstraction, right? So the categorical imperative would hold that you can understand the goodness of something independent of reality, the action, or natural observation. And that was kind of an attempt to get around what at that time was the pre-Humean is ought fallacy, right? And the same emergence has happened on the right. Now, Aquinas would reject all of that in the same strain as Maimonides, right? Both Jewish classical scholastics and Catholic scholastics would agree that the way we understand the law is rooted in not only tradition and practice, but that tradition's reason for creating harmony and human flourishing.
I see. Okay.
I'll end this rant on this. For listeners that are interested in how this manifests in the law, look at the very famous case Bostock. So we're going to talk about the right wing in jurisprudence, right? So you have the Federalist Society. I don't know if you've seen the news on this. Trump is very critical of the Federalist Society because this strand known as textualism, and really in a very similar light, what I call kind of this proto-proceduralism, which is that the process is good within of itself, independent of the reason for the process or the text. And that really is this strain of legal jurisprudence, which is a form of Gnosticism. And what we're getting around on the right is that we don't care about process in of itself. We don't care about text in of itself. We care about the outcomes that it creates. And that's the view that law, as an ordinance of reason, promulgated by legitimate authority, is rooted, important words, in the common good. And so this is a very roundabout way of describing why Catholicism is so important. And it's because it gives us a rooted way in which to live life. Now you can make that, Maimonides makes this whole argument about Judaism, right? That is basically the TLDR of Maimonides' argument. Now, I would argue there are important proofs, and we can probably have a different theological debate on the necessity of the resurrection and the Messiah. And Judaism also, to be fair, has an idea of the Messiah. We would argue about if you could have part divine, part human. But the point of the matter is, it's about rooting your life in the practical that creates human flourishing.
Sure. Okay. No, I think that was a really interesting digression.
Exactly.
So, okay, let's regret. No, this is great. So, right before we started recording, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, probably the most
Ooh,
unhinged right-wing person. She had a
no,
tweet.
not the most unhinged.
Okay, well,
But
let me read from I don't usually read verbatim tweets on here, but this was about an hour ago. She tweeted today, and we're talking, this is Tuesday, June 24th. She said, "There was once a great president that the American people loved. He opposed Israel's nuclear program, and then he was assassinated." She's obviously referring to JFK. So she's basically insinuating that Israel assassinated an American president for opposing the nuclear program. So I mean that is a type of, because you were talking before about sort of the mainstream and the activists, but one of the things that's been happening in the last couple of years is both on the right and the left, those categories have sort of collapsed, right? Like, is Marjorie Taylor Greene an activist? Just the same way
she's
as
definitely an institutionalist by
right, she's an
by my
institutionalist.
political
So
definition.
how do we get somebody like her blaming the assassination of an American president, right? It's the same way where I'm sure that you've seen this, but just to explain for listeners, you have the, this idea that Israel caused 9/11 or that Israelis were dancing during 9/11. You have this whole idea there was a U.S. ship named the USS Liberty that America sent, to the Middle East in the Six-Day War, leading up to that. It's a lot more, Israel essentially accidentally bombed the ship, right? You can read the Wikipedia page on it, whatever,
Yeah,
read your famous article.
it happened.
It was,
I mean,
no, sure. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about for listeners. I'm just
yeah,
framing this. It was obviously an accident. But of course, in sort of right-wing anti-Zionist lore, this was the Israelis just deciding to destroy a ship for the hell of it, right? It's still unclear why exactly they think Israel would do it, that one time. But like, this is becoming more mainstream on the right with people like, Marjorie Taylor Greene and others. Right? I believe Matt Gaetz has sort of played around, not with the same level of, Marjorie Taylor Greene insanity, but, sort of similar ideas of, strong anti-Zionism, being really upset with Trump for, even striking Iran the other day. So, that, just to, get us circled, you don't seem as alarmed at this prospect or surprised, but, just to push you a little bit, I mean, if a Democratic, that probably, that Marjorie Taylor Greene, and her, other ideas about Israel and Jews, those probably do qualify for the most anti-Semitic things ever tweeted by a congresswoman. I mean, that's worse than Ilhan Omar, and everything like
yeah.
that.
But yeah, this is why I don't like tweeting too much. For
Well, but you
one,
don't accidentally tweet that the Jews killed the president, meaning like,
come on, but that's such a meme. I mean, anyone who's reading this in context would understand that can't possibly be taken seriously. Like,
no,
so here, allow me to make my position. I get
okay.
what you're saying. What you're saying is obviously that's absurd. And if she actually meant that, then yes, that would be anti-Semitic.
But what do you mean by it? But this is an interesting thing that I see a lot of, and we've had this debate before, but I, might as well unearth it here on the podcast. The right has a very almost a get out of jail free card. I think it applies both to Trump and also both to conversations like this, where if Democrats say something, they have to mean it, and if Trump or a right wing person says something, it's sort of in this, Schrodinger's cat, liminal position of, is it true or is it a meme? If it turns out to be a good idea, it was real. And if it turns out that this was a terrible idea, it's Trump, he's just bullshitting, or it's just a meme. And I just think that's, not just unfair, but it's also dangerous. Meaning, there has been, a lot of still, I think this is true, but if it's not true, somebody please correct me. At least in terms of America, in terms of historic anti-Semitic incidents of actual, death to Jews. I believe probably the left has more incidents of anti-Semitism. I think every time, more than 3 progressives gather in public, there's some anti-Semitism happening there these days. But in terms of actual threat to lives of Jews, I believe it's still the right. And so these things obviously do cause, harm, even if they are sort of, for 99% of people listening, like, oh, haha, what a meme.
Yeah. I'm going to break this into 2 categories. So the cynical category would describe it as I've told you before, kind of this anti-normative memes, create clicks, create revenue, / create donations from schizos who want to donate to the guy who calls out the Jewish conspiracy, which helps you win campaigns. That is the purely cynical view. It's one, unfortunately, you see in political campaigns, right? Sometimes, especially when you have a deep red district, you have to distinguish yourself. You just have to break through the noise. This is partially why really AI and social media is going to create a lot of negative feedback loops, because the only way to break through the noise is to say the most unhinged, crazy thing. And you see that a lot with AI, right? Like, oh, I created AGI and I'm going to dominate the world and that gets you the most clicks. Then suddenly your product's making millions of dollars. So we don't really have a good market check on sanity right now. That being said, let's take it charitably for a moment. The jester's privilege is kind of an ancient tradition. It's been one that's been on the right, if you want to call the right. I'm really not sure what the right means. I'm saying very generically people who are quote unquote conservative, people who believe, if I had to describe the rights, people who believe in the highest good as ordering the hierarchy of society, as opposed to progressives who believe everyone should be equal, or we should at least pursue equality at the cost of hierarchy or anything else. And that hierarchy on the right creates human flourishing. Lack of hierarchy creates human flourishing on the left.
When you say hierarchy, you mean like a meritocratic hierarchy, not a racial or gender?
Sure, but I think people, a lot of right-wing scholars would say like incidental hierarchies are good. So, for example, you would expect in a true right-wing hierarchy for there to be some sort of gendered hierarchy within the family, right? So within Catholicism, it would be Christ is the head of the family, and the man leads the wife to Christ, right? The wife submits to the man, even if they act in partnership, practically speaking. That's another conversation, though. Generally speaking, the right is not opposed to hierarchy, even if it would seem on the left to be discriminatory, as long as it's an ordered hierarchy. So disordered
hierarchy is not ipso facto bad.
Yeah.
On the right. Okay.
As long as it's producing flourishing. So like you can imagine a society in which you have completely traditional marriages, women have no jobs, but it creates human flourishing, and that's a good thing, right? Likewise, you can imagine one that's totally perverse and traditional marriages, and it's not creating human flourishing, and then it's bad. So again, the right cares about outcomes. Let's get back to the jester's privilege. This is really a medieval privilege, right? You see it across the world. Japan, there's a really famous example of King Philip, I think the sixth, jester coming to him at the Battle of Slurs, and he says to King Philip, the English sailors don't even have the guts to jump into the water like our brave French. And obviously, usually you'd be killed for that sort of criticism, but because he was the jester, he got away with it, right? And this has really been encapsulated on the right because the right is inherently institutionalist. It wants to take the role as the jester, right? When Trump says something edgy, even as a populist, he really in some ways is a structuralist. He's blending himself in, much like the jester is. He is not a revolutionary. They might take on the stripes of revolutionaries. We might even have the spirit of revolutionaries, but we are never taking the role of a revolutionary because we're institutionalists at our core. We believe in hierarchy. And I think that describes a lot of why the right employs this jester's privilege.
But let me, push back because, I probably listen to too many podcasts for my own sanity. And so, over the years, I've dabbled in different podcasts. And one of the things, and this has sort of always been my criticism. Even, there have been years where I've appreciated Joe Rogan's podcast. There's been years that I've been, sickened by it. In the last half a year, I've been sickened by it. But, that aside, one of the things that I've always found a little bit unfair is that because he's a comedian, he can always come out with ideas and then again claim what you're saying, jester's privilege. But it's one thing if, the jester, just by dint of the medieval tradition, like has no power. So the jester can sit there and say whatever they want.
This is a perfect point. I like this.
And the jester won't be killed by the guards. But at the end of the day, if the jester says, oh, haha, what's up with those redheaded people? Like, that's so weird. We should kill them all. Everybody could laugh, but it's another thing when you have the most popular podcast in the world and you're saying, oh, jester's privilege. Like, that's not jester. You are now the king, right? Like, in some way, the metaphor is off.
And here's where things are changing, right? And you're correct in this capacity, which is the right needs to figure out how to govern. For so long, the right has been in the fringe minority. Think about on campus, right? On campuses, the right kind of had this jester's privilege because we had no power. We were never going to do anything. We could never harm anyone really outside of our words. Yeah, people say we're engaging in violence. The worst thing is a right-winger maybe incidentally, individually, they can attack someone, but they can never structurally do it, right? They can never implement policy. And that has really changed really in the past year, right? Even downstream institutions are becoming increasingly dominated by the right. The judiciary will be dominated by the right probably for at least the next 20 to 30 years, just based on how the life tenure system is. And so really we're going to see this movement from the right as the truth giver to the sovereign as the sovereign itself. And that you're correct that the right is going to have to figure out how to actually start making claims to power, as opposed to just kind of being the jester and dancing around in the little clown outfit, right? Now, of course, there is still a role for the jester in that society, right?
But arguably now the role of the jester is the people making fun of the people with power, meaning like
absolutely,
sure. So, but they still haven't realized that, right? So that's the fear, is that if somebody like Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan, who probably two of the most popular five figureheads in America in terms of popular audience, if they are playing the role of outsider and they're pretending like, oh, we're just poking fun at the Jews, it's almost always coded for.
So Tucker Carlson, I'll defend him for a moment. Like, a lot of what he was saying are genuine frustrations on the right, frustrations you've heard me make since 2018, right? I was frustrated. I didn't think Israel was using their resources appropriately, and obviously, I know Dennis Prager would obviously say we shouldn't have a say in that. I think we should. This is the right-wing perspective, right? If we are giving them money, we have a right to say how they are going to use it.
Sure. Now I'm making a more general point, right? Like when Tucker Carlson, I think it was like a year and a half ago, hosted what's his name, Daryl Cooper, right? The sort of pseudo historian, and he wasn't saying, right, it'd be one thing, and I still wouldn't say it's good, but it's one thing if you say,
okay, listen, can I pose a hypo? I get where you're going. Let me pose you a hypo.
Wait. Let me just spell it out for our listeners, who maybe can't read my mind as well as you after arguing with me for 7 years. Right. It'd be one thing if Tucker Carlson said, hey, I have this podcast and I'm just interested in hearing from people with outlandish ideas. And so we're going to talk to the guy who thinks dinosaurs are not real and the moon landing was fake. And then also the guy who's sort of like the, Holocaust revisionist. I would still say that's bad. But Tucker Carlson said, we have probably the most important historian of the 21st century, and then turns on the mics and let this guy spews Holocaust revisionism. Like that's just bad, right? Like, and, this obviously is a little bit a field of, anti-Zionism. That's not anti-Zionism. That's explicit anti-Semitism. Anyway, what was your hypothetical?
Yeah. So the hypothetical is basically this. On the right, the view is that the dialectic is important regardless of content. You'd probably say that is kind of what these comedians or podcasters are saying, right?
Just to spell that out, what you're saying, and let me know if I understand you correctly, it's always important to have an alternative opinion regardless of what the conversation is.
Essentially.
Is that true for, would you say that's true for people who are atheists?
Yeah, absolutely. Like people, especially people who are atheists, if anything, are going to be the biggest skeptics, right? At least on the right.
No, but I mean, like, because the right, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but, positions like, lack thereof of religion, or say like LGBT rights or like abortion rights, I don't see a lot of people on the right saying, well, I'm anti-abortion, but I still think it's, good to hear out opinions that are, in favor of war. They just say, no, it's murder, right? Like, so
no, I disagree with that. We hosted tons and tons of pro-choice speakers. Like probably the only thing the right would have qualms about, and even then we'd probably host someone, is if you violated a first principle. I don't mean that as like life is important. I would even go further and probably say like a first principle for the right would be you are willing to engage in the dialectic to begin with, right? So you pointed this out, a lot of Palestinian activists are not willing to engage in the dialectic. So they would obviously be out.
Meaning if you start a conversation saying like, you are a Nazi, nothing I can do, nothing you do will change my mind, yes. Okay, fair.
Yeah, and we like even if you're not changing the debater's mind, right? Debates are not meant to change the debater's mind; they're meant to inform the audience.
Sure.
Like you at least have to have a speaker that's willing to engage in that conversation. If you're not, then obviously it's hopeless. I think the right is just willing because we're still in kind of the jester mindset. We're willing to entertain basically anyone. I'll give you an example. This is the hype I wanted to bring up. So you remember back when the college Republicans at UCI brought Milo, right? I
Milo
believe
Yiannopoulos, just to
yes,
give a little bit more background for people that are not acculturated to campus right-wing politics.
yes. Milo Yiannopoulos. He's a very edgy guy. He's kind of fallen out of mainstream. I believe he fell out a little after my time, mostly because pedophilic comments he made. Now he's apparently right-wing Catholic, which still confused me because I thought he was gay. Which, no offense to listeners that might not view a traditional life, that is not within the realms of the Catholic Catechism. I think Milo would agree with that, by the way. But the point of the matter is, I remember it was either you or somebody else messaged me and is like, please don't bring him. He's like anti-Semitic. Which he probably was. And regardless, we wanted to have the debate with him, right? Now, let's apply that. Would you be surprised? Would you think it's anti-Semitic on the right to platform somebody who is admittingly pretty far out there, but to have a debate? Let's say we had a debate between Ben Shapiro and Nick Fuentes. Like, do you think that would be furthering anti-Semitism?
I think it depends what the social sphere is. I think if there was a group of people that were on the, young right-wing men who were maybe torn between those two, that might be a very valiant thing to do. But if you are, say, Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan, and you have, no matter what you put out, 20 million people are going to listen to it, and then you have a debate like that, that's sort of outside of the Overton window. So I agree that within an Overton window, you always want debate. So minimum wage, yes, I always want a debate. Social policy, yes. Welfare,
Well,
yes.
I think so. Okay, this is a prudential decision then, because you have to decide what's within the Overton window. I think you can increasingly make an argument, and I think this is unfortunate. Put my cards on the table. You've known me for 7, 8 years now. I am pro-Zionist. I'm just going to say that. I've been pro-Zionist. I've been probably one of the most consistent people I know on this, actually, because most people have changed their opinions over time. Besides you, obviously. But, like, for example, I'm not sure Nick Fuentes is so far outside the Overton window anymore, for better or worse, because of social media. And
but
you
I
actually
think, well, it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, meaning he's not outside the Overton window because people platform him, and then he becomes part. Like, it's almost like, where do you, right? Like,
okay, this is a prudential decision.
No, but like somebody like, somebody who will get up there, like Daryl Cooper, and will say, killing Jews was not, a main part of Nazi ideology. I believe I listened to that episode. It was a year and a half ago, but I believe he says something like, it was just sort of like an afterthought for the Nazis. They just like needed to put the Jew somewhere, and then like at some point, yeah, there was some sort of systematic killing, but it was much smaller and, much more of a side project when, basically historians, real historians essentially blame the loss of the Nazis in World War II because they focused so many resources on killing Jews, meaning, it's almost like,
I know.
Well, I don't need to spell that out to you. So there, if you have a group of like Holocaust skeptics, maybe it makes sense to sort of have that debate between him and a Holocaust historian. But if you just have like a big platform, there doesn't really, it doesn't really make sense to platform past a certain Overton window. Listen, I've actually caught a lot of flack. This might be interesting for you. But I've obviously hosted, some pretty anti-Israel people on this podcast. I've hosted some pretty right-wing people on this podcast. And, every time I do that, I'm sure, with this episode also, but, most recently I had a debate, is Israel committing genocide with somebody who thinks yes. And I caught a lot of flack from a lot of people saying, why would you platform him? Now, for me, I would argue, within an Overton window of at least most of the people listening to this call, this podcast, they've heard a lot of people say that Israel's committing genocide. So it was important to have that conversation. But like, I don't know if you can say the same, at a certain point, like that definitely ends.
Sure. And we can have that debate later. I definitely think you're a little too liberal on that one for me. But like, okay, if we're going to tangibly talk about platforming for a very quick moment. It is very obvious that because of the modern prevalence of Copilot and AI programming skills, and even before that, the just plethora of programmers. For example, deplatforming Nick Fuentes was the worst thing that anyone could have done, because then he created his own platform, Cozy TV, and makes far greater revenues. Once somebody has made it,
I'm not
the
talking about.
noise.
Sorry. Just to restate it. I'm not saying that people should be taken off of social media sites. That's something else. I'm talking about if you have a podcast, right? Like me wanting Nick Fuentes to be kicked off of Facebook has nothing to do with whether or not I would invite him onto my podcast. I don't think he should be kicked off of Facebook, right?
So let me point this out. The way to kill a lot of these edgy thinkers is to confront them on their logic. I've actually talked to a lot of leaders in the Republican Party about this, in activist groups. The fear with Fuentes specifically is people are afraid of his charisma. That's just being blatant about it. Because the fear is if you lose, right? So there is a bad assumption on debating platforms that reason alone is sufficient. The classics never thought that, right?
No, but it's also unfair. Rhetoric. Meaning, let's say I were to enter a debate with a with a flat earther, right?
Okay.
I think I'm a relatively good debater. I think I'm relatively sharp and quick, but I think there's a good chance I would lose because I haven't read any of their material. I'm not going to spend 2 years of my life becoming an expert on flat Earth arguments. So obviously, if I just happen to have a podcast and I'm like, yeah, I'm willing to entertain any ideas and I think I could hold my own in a debate, and then I'm talking to a flat earther and they start talking about all these experiments and these parachutes that they've launched, and in 1992 this happened. I don't know. I can't fact check that in real time. So it's very likely that people listening to that maybe, let's say, you give that to an alien that doesn't actually know if the Earth is flat or not. After listening to that podcast, they might conclude, oh my God, Earth must be flat because the guy that was on the spherical Earth side didn't actually know about the weather balloon experiment of the Great Pacific Ocean of 1970. So of course, if he doesn't know, right? So there is a little bit of unfairness, right? Like, being an expert on a conspiracy theory, you could come across as smarter, right? Just the same way, neither of us, I won't use Christianity as an example because you're a Christian, but I'll use, Islam as an example. Neither of us are experts on the Quran or the Hadiths yet. And if we were, in a conversation with, an Islamic thinker about whether or not, something about the Hadiths, we'd lose, but that says nothing about the epistemological strength of the hadiths being, so you sort of get what I'm talking about, right? So I don't think, that's where I think platforming.
So for viewers, basically, the argument you're furthering is that conspiracy theorists have a really niche set of knowledge, specifically empirical knowledge. And that empirical knowledge is difficult to fact check on the run. And as a result, you're going to overestimate their credibility in a way that a debate cannot handle.
I would have no idea. I'll even sharpen it. I honestly, honest to God, would have no idea where to start combating the claim. If somebody says, all of the pictures of concentration camps are completely bunk, and when they actually looked at the remains that they had and did all this blah, blah, blah testing, they realized there couldn't possibly have been more than 2 million people. I don't know.
So there's debates on methodologies, right? But
I don't know those debates. I listen. I'm sure Deborah Lipstadt, or somebody who's an expert on this, she literally won a court case about this because she obviously, the evidence was on her side. I believe the evidence is on her side. It would be wholly irresponsible of me to have a debate with somebody who is a Holocaust denier, knowing full well, even if I think I am smarter than that person, and And even if I think I know more about the Holocaust than them, which I think uncertainly I would know less about this certain conspiracy theory.
There's an easy answer to that. Just line them up with another expert.
Yeah, but why? I guess what I'm asking is, if I, let's say this podcast, right now I only get a couple thousand, or maybe 10,000 on a good episode, but in 5 years from now, when I'm getting 10 million listens an episode, why should I set up a debate between two experts on something that I think is right outside the Overton window. Like, I don't want people coming home to their roommates and saying, I listened to this fascinating podcast today about whether, about the Holocaust. Did you know this is actually an open inquiry, right? Like, it's not an open inquiry. There are some things that are, meaning, like, I do think, let's say, the origin of COVID, right? I think it's crazy that there was not open conversation about whether or not it was from a lab or the wet market.
So to make this relevant to the viewers, let's bring it back to the tangible example of Nick Fuentes, right? I think he's a good one. He's the elephant in the room here, right? Because obviously Richard Spencer is just kind of outside of it. You would probably say platforming Tucker Carlson is reasonable, given he already has a platform. But let's talk about Nick Fuentes. He doesn't have a platform.
Yeah, I think I would have to say that.
And by the way, he does have a platform. He's built his own platform, which is, again, why I think it's reasonable to debate him, because he's going to be out there anyway. But even assuming he's not, I mean, this whole podcast is predicated on the fact that his ideas have basically percolated throughout right-wing discourse. So it seems like that's exactly the type of person you'd want to debate.
No, but listen, I've had plenty of podcasts about why is jihadism so popular on campus. I don't think,
you wouldn't debate. I think you tried to debate some of those Palestinians who clearly are pro-jihadism.
I guess that's fair. I guess I might differentiate that in my head from like an actual Hamas person, but maybe you're right. Maybe I am not applying the same logic. All right, fair enough.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying.
See, right? You're getting smarter as you're getting more, more shots in you. You're just
exactly. I need to be taking more. No, and look, I agree with you that I understand your frustration. Your frustration is that we're going to platform somebody, their ideas are going to be furthered, and eventually they're going to harm Jews. I totally understand that. My argument is prudentially the opposite will occur, and we've already seen that. When you deplatform Nick Fuentes, he creates his own platform, Cozy TV. He draws way greater revenue streams. He now has control over that. And then when he gets or replatformed, which they always eventually do, then he's able to start pointing people back to his own platform. Having a centralized form of discussion is so much healthier to preventing the echo chambers. This is getting back to my CEO position, my concern with AI. My concern with AI is that it's going to reflect our deepest, darkest demons. Eventually we will get to the point we already have of people literally talking to themselves, right? Because of how AI has reinforcement training, it's going to learn your preferences and mirror them. And what I am trying to do is shatter the mirrors. The only way to shatter the mirrors is with confrontation. It's with being edgy. And that's why you have to allow these people into debates. Or they're just going to eventually take over the discourse. And this is why conspiracy theories are so powerful. Conspiracy theories capture the human imagination, which is the way to break through the white noise. This is just, perfect example of this. I wrote an article back when I was coming out of UCI. I used to be a very hardcore structuralist, more in the Waltzian neo-realist train of thought that we could control society by promulgating certain procedures. Wrote a study on this in the United Nations, basically compared two machine learning models. Machine learning model 1 was trained on the different motions, procedural rules, stances of delegates, their express policies, and used that to predict voting outcomes. And the second one was a very simple machine learning algorithm, feature extracted with a language library called Lilac. It's just a psychological library of important phrases. Compare the accuracy between them. Which one do you think was far more accurate at predicting voting outcomes and policy? Just give me a guess.
Second one.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all because human psychology is so much more predictive than our traditional ideas of government. Psychology is what's capturing people now. And in order to get there, we have to go to where people are. That's what debates. In fact, I would make an argument, if we had a Nick Fuentes, Ben Shapiro debate, it would probably be one of the most viewed debates in America right now. And that can be concerning because if Nick Fuentes wins, obviously evil ideas, right? That's the argument. But nonetheless, those ideas are going to continue to percolate regardless. And by the way, historically, the way these figures are defeated, a la Milo, is by confronting them on podcasts. You were able to tense out what his ideas were, understand what his arguments are, and then you're able to finally expose them for what they are. If you allow people's
No, I think you're probably mostly right. I mean, we have run definitely a field of sort of just the rise of general, anti-Zionism on the right. But I think, maybe the one sort of open question I would have is I do think it is somewhat of a chicken or egg question, which, one could imagine, there are groups of people who I'm sure that there's people that are trying to get bestiality laws, for marriages turned
Sure.
back, or, they think that there should be thruples and that should be, legally binding and, federal law that you should, and all of that. And like these questions are significantly outside of the Overton window where like I'm sure there is some, subreddit, or sub 4chan, whatever, people talking about bestiality, but like I don't think the best way to defeat that is to,
And look, to criticize the right, we deplatformed the LGBTQ community. We never allowed them to have open debates. And when we did, we were completely disarmed. The right had no response, right? Basically, the whole right's arguments, and if you read like Obergefell, for example, it basically reads as a sermon against the right, who basically described gay people as icky, right? It was a taste thing. They never got into the actual intellectual arguments on the right for traditional marriage. And the left has had the same problem. They attempted to deplatform all their enemies, ignore what they were saying, and then they were completely unprepared when they came back into the mainstream.
You're right, but we are kind of talking about two different things at the same time. So I just want to spell it out.
Okay, let's get it back. Yeah.
And then we'll see if there's anywhere else we want to go just before coming in for a landing. Yep. One, we're talking about general platforming, maybe even does Facebook have to abide by the First Amendment? Should one want somebody to get kicked off of Facebook for something? And there I would be very liberal in terms of there's almost nothing one could write on Facebook for which I would want them to be kicked off of Facebook, because I kind of agree with you that sunlight tends to be the best disinfectant. Obviously once you're overtly calling for violence, that's a different thing. But I think general First Amendment should apply to these companies, whether or not that's a, constitutional argument or just a business argument, right? I don't want to get into that. The second is me personally. I have a platform. I have a podcast. I have a class that I teach at UCI with, 60 students. I have, a community of people who look up to me as a leader, and I can bring whoever I want to speak to, a group of 100 students, whenever I want to do it. The people that I'm going to choose there, that's a whole different set of responsibility. That's not a First Amendment thing. My podcast is not a First Amendment thing where, let's say you have some guy walks down the hall and sees that you're recording a podcast right now and says, oh, I think that all people with, brown hair should be put into camps, right? Like,
Sure. Okay. So let me interject there.
I don't need to say, oh, wow, let's bring this guy in. Let's really engage with that, because I actually disagree with him.
Yeah, sure. So the homeless schizo guy, obviously, he has no presence already. But I'm saying to people who have a pre-established presence, Nick Fuentes has a pre-established presence. He is undoubtedly at least somewhat of an important podcaster. I think it'd be pretty hard to argue otherwise.
Sure.
I think you could have said, at least during my time, the same about Milo, say a lot about Candace Owens. You could say that, you would have to be blind not to think that about Tucker Carlson. And so that's the difference, right? You're not platforming a nobody. You're doing a lot of good by bringing someone who's already platformed in, and you're showing them sunlight, right? You're showing their ideas to everybody for what they are, because otherwise they're unchallenged.
Yeah, no, okay. I think that's fair, even though I think I would squabble. And certainly, also what I was talking about before with people like Joe Rogan or, because sure. I don't think Joe Rogan is an anti-Semite, but he will have people come on and instead of, sunlight being the best disinfectant, he'll just listen to them for 2 hours and sort of encourage them, right? That's something entirely different. It's one thing to debate, somebody who's going to be revisionist thinker on all these things and say, I really disagree with you. It's another to say like, wow, oh, really? I never knew that. Right. Like, so there are sort of like, different things that we're talking about.
So again, I haven't seen that episode, but I do want to, disagree with this a little. I think we vastly underestimate the intelligence of our audiences to understand what we're saying. And this is a big problem with modern TV, right? The reason it's such slop is that it gives you no ability to infer or imply. It just says it right in front of you. It's the Marvel movie fallacy, right? And so the problem with all of this is I still think there's some good being done there if the person is already platformed, because people are able to hear in long form what they actually think. And I think there's value in both. I think that person should be exposed to debate, but I also think they should have a chance to say what they believe and, more importantly, substantiate it and be subject to questioning. Maybe Joe Rogan didn't question him well enough there. I don't know. Like, obviously, if you're just like, yeah, that's good. But to be fair, I've listened to Joe Rogan a lot, and usually what I get from his episodes is he does try to push back. Now, sometimes I don't think it's...
Okay, fair. I mean, that's that. I think I disagree, but I want to move us along. You know, we have been talking for a while. You know, I guess if I were to really, you know, take your advice of your knowledge of the right, you know, my next question would be, can you introduce me to all these people? But you know, I'm mostly mostly kidding, but maybe we'll talk after. Anything else that you think is pertinent to this conversation of anti-Zionism, Israel, isolationism, right wing? You know, what have we not covered?
Yeah. So the reason I think we should cover this, first off, talking about Israel and the Iranian issue. The reason I think this whole conversation is happening is because Israel's in the news, and it's because of the Iranian crisis. I think if the Iranian crisis was not happening, Israel would not nearly be as much in the news. Now, of course,
but to be fair, you will vouch for this. You know, I messaged you about doing this episode long before Iran even got involved. So, this clearly was true. Even 2 or 3 months ago, even a year ago, this was a thing.
Sure, but not nearly as much. You would not have Tucker Carlson out there as loudly denouncing the issue with Ted Cruz as you would have had back then. And I mean, to be fair as well, both you and I are interested in the issue disproportionately compared to, you know, the average American. And you probably get Instagram memes fed to you because you're Jewish and it knows you're Jewish and it wants you to click or look at them, and something that offends you gets more clicks. But I think it'd be significantly less prevalent. That being stated, I agree with you that the right needs to move out of its jester role and into more of the, you know, I published a great article in the Salient about this, and the King Josiah role, right? We need to see this perverse land for what it is. It has numerous atrocities, and move out of kind of our just procedural role of, you know, Roe v. Wade's gone, people just vote and do what they want, and actually begin to engage in a substantively conservative advocacy. You know, there is a lot of ideological consensus the right is building. The transgender issue, complete 180 from what it was. Even the ideas of traditional marriage, we see the polls shifting on that. And so because the right is the institutions, the right will undoubtedly be in power, at least in the court systems, for the next 20 to 30 years. I agree with you. We need to start putting on our big boy pants and actually engaging in substantive dialogue instead of just, you know, the next shit post. The next, I don't know, did you see Trump throwing around like, the previous Russian president is throwing around the N-word, right? Obviously, that was a joke, right? But because of all of these different expressions, we need to fight back against that a little. And the reason we should engage in a temperate idea of governance is because that's simply what God intends in order to fulfill our agenda.
Okay, well, I appreciate the conversation. I think this was a lot of fun. We covered a lot of ground here. I definitely have not done an episode like this, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Look forward to our next debate on natural law.
There we go. Yeah, well, I mean, I've been thinking so much about AI. I don't know if I have specific questions about it, but, you know, thinking about, you know, because you sort of have these two camps on AI. You have the sort of doomsdayist, you know, no matter what we do, it's sort of going to run unchecked. And then other people that are saying,
they're just looking for a God that's not there. If you go read their tweets, right? They need to just go back to church or something, or synagogue.
That's hilarious. Well, anyway, Kimo, thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel.